Howdy, folks. Today we're looking at Hawkman Annual number 2 from 1993 in DC Comics, Chapter 10 of Bloodlines. And so the clock ticks over and we enter the second phase of the event, Earthplague. It is logical to ask what has changed, what signifies the inauguration of the Earthplague in contrast to the outbreak. The answer is nothing. There is no difference between stages. There is no concerted reaction, no information sharing, no official investigation. Both the Bruce Wayne and Jean-Paul Vallée Batman have encountered giant parasites from outer space, and the information has yet to filter its way down to Robin. And since we're on the subject, Robin doesn't even encounter the aliens who appear in this comic for a total of 7 pages and have no impact on the plot outside of giving 2 of the characters superpowers. Everyone involved, from the creators on down, wants as little to do with the alien parasites as possible. This despite Venom being featured prominently on the cover. This scene does not occur. It is drawn by Jim Balin, who does not draw the interior of the comic book. The interior of the comic book is drawn by Kieran Dwyer, which means the comic book looks very good once you get past the relative lack of alien parasites. What's more, the comic book is even partially inked by the great Jose Luis Garcia Lopez. Not the whole thing, sadly, but the fact is that Dwyer's pencils are tight enough to survive multiple inkers. I've always been a fan of Dwyer. He never misses, and so too here. He seems to enjoy drawing the dramatic skyline of Gotham City. I confess, I was a huge fan of Robin in this period, the early solo years stemming out of Nightfall. There's a reason why people are still so attached to the Tim Drake character. DC and, yes, writer Chuck Dixon especially, put a lot of work into making him likable. People in the early 90s were not destined to love Robin, and yet he became one of the period's most beloved characters, and not without good reason. Now, while the significance of this Hawkman Annual to the overall Bloodline saga may very well be negligible, it is significant for one reason. This issue marks the premiere of my favorite of the New Blood characters. Yes, Razor Sharp and her cyber rats. Not Hitman. Were you expecting me to say Hitman? Hitman's great, but was he a cute teenage hacker who could turn his hands into knives? Friend, I fear you already know the answer. Razor Sharp and the cyber rats are good old-fashioned industrial spies, and the plot here gets underway when they attempt to hack into Wayne Tech's private servers. As soon as Robin figures out the cyber rats are lead hacksaws instead of just regular criminals, he practically falls all over himself trying to join them, which is the kind of endearing nonsense Tim Drake was known for in his prime. As for Razor Sharp, a whopping 20 appearances, including 3 issues of her own miniseries, place her in the upper echelon of New Blood, even if, yes, she was also later killed by Superboy Prime and subsequently resurrected as a Black Lantern. Howdy, folks. Today we're looking at Action Comics Annual number 5 from 1993 in DC Comics, Chapter 11 of Bloodlines. The Earthplague grinds on as the parasites return to Metropolis and interact with the third of the faux Supermen created for the reign of the Superman crossover. The Superman featured in the pages of Action was cold and distant, with a more draconian sense of justice. Although he was the one who resembled Superman the most physically, he was eventually revealed to be another iteration of the Eradicator, a Kryptonian robot that bedeviled the character's immediate post-crisis period. The Eradicator didn't get the same boost from the storyline as Steel or Superboy, and frankly, it's not hard to see why from this story. The character was uncharismatic, lacking much in the way of personality. This chapter introduced us to Loose Cannon, a character who could charitably be described as a Hulk knockoff. He's not even one of the worst characters in the story so far, actually. Loose Cannon would actually have to be counted in the upper percentile of New Blood, at least in terms of things like having a personality and backstory. Loose Cannon is Eddie Walker, a cop and former member of the Metropolis Special Crimes Unit. They spent some time developing the SCU at the time, with Maggie Sawyer even getting to headline an SCU miniseries in 1994. Eddie was, however, injured in the line of duty due to his own reckless actions, leaving him in the situation we find him at the beginning of the story. Still able to walk with the aid of braces, but unable to do his previous job and falling into a fit of depression. An extended sequence of him ominously loading his service revolver in his living room is interrupted only by a phone call from Sawyer, requesting his help on a series of killings in the Skid Row district, because of course the bodies are still piling up from the parasites. You know the drill by now. Eddie gets waylaid by a curvy redhead and wakes up with amnesia and superpowers. As Loose Cannon, his powers change, and his strength along with his color, just like a mood ring. So he goes from blue to purple to pink in the course of a fight. The most interesting aspect of the issue would probably be the credits box. As modest as the story may be, it's significant for one important reason. It's the second comics work by Jeff Loeb, following only his 1991 Challengers of the Unknown miniseries with Tim Sale. This is also early work for Lee Moder within the first year or so of his tenure at DC. It's journeyman work for both men, but still far from the worst of these. That would be the Green Lantern Annual. As for loose cannon, he did pretty well for himself, with 21 appearances, including a 4-issue mini with early art by Adam Paulina. He also managed to survive Infinite Crisis, so good for him. Howdy, folks. Today we're looking at Legion of Superheroes Annual number 4 from 1993 in DC Comics, Chapter 12 of Bloodlines. So far in our journey into the past, we've experienced both the good and the bad, so it only makes sense we'd eventually find our way to the ugly. And it doesn't get much uglier than our specimen today, in which the Legion find themselves very temporarily dragged into the events of the ongoing Earthplague. Now, as far as the Legion goes, this annual serves one purpose. It marks the return of Timberwolf to the 30th century, after spending a year in the 20th. Of course, not much came of that year. He didn't even get to join the Justice League, so if you're wondering just how this story manages to shoehorn the alien parasites, that ties into the how. In the story's present, 2995, the scattered members of the Legion are dealing with the menace of Mordru, resurrecting all the dead people in the galaxy as zombies. Somehow in that scuffle, the Invisible Kid sits on a computer terminal that loads a dangerous time travel retrieval program aimed at Timberwolf. I'm serious, he butt dials the 20th century. But of course, the retrieval just happens to occur at the exact moment in the summer of 1993 when Timberwolf is tracking down a serial killer in San Francisco. And we all know the serial killer in question, our friend Angon, who's got a scheme involving luring men to help her with car trouble and then hiding the bodies in the trunk. And so we are introduced to this issue's new blood, the misbegotten Jam. Certainly no hero closer to a villain, but for the fact that he's absolutely wretched. Jam is a terrible person, not to mention annoying. He's essentially Pauly Shore in comic book form, painful words to type and to speak. He rides around San Francisco on a skateboard and just happens to be Angon's dinner at the moment when the parasite is attacked by Timberwolf and all three parties are summarily transported back to the future. So, the Legion of Superheroes fight the parasite for about 5 minutes before stuffing it back in the time machine and sending it back whence it came. But because he requires medical attention, Jam sticks around. And before he can be sent back, he discovers that he has a new superpower. He can have anyone do what he wants just by asking. Yes, this loathsome creature gets the same powers as the Purple Man, one of Marvel's creepiest villains, and subsequently leads the gang on a merry adventure across the galaxy. Would you believe he spends a great deal of this issue telling the female members of the Legion of Superheroes to take their clothes off? They act as chauffeurs on a private tour of the galaxy, crashing future rock shows and traveling to planets filled with nothing but ladies in skimpy beachwear. Eventually, Jam almost gets them killed, and he has to release Shadow Last from his control, lest they be swallowed by a star that Jam was unwise enough to steer directly into. In any event, once they free themselves of Jam's control, they yeet him back to the 20th century with prejudice, saying goodbye to the business of annual crossovers forever. To say Jam met with a muted response would be an understatement. He appears 3 times total before falling into oblivion. They didn't even bother bringing him back to get killed in Infinite Crisis. Deeply ironic, considering he's the one of the New Bloods who could actually have defeated Superboy Prime, a battle royale that will have to live only in our imaginations. It took 9 people to draw this comic, and since none of them asked to be associated with Jam, we'll just leave it at that. Howdy, folks. Today we're looking at Green Arrow Annual number 6 from 1993 in DC Comics, Chapter 13 of Bloodlines. By 1993, Mike Grell had spent 7 years at the helm of Green Arrow. Although his tenure was not without controversy, it's also inarguable that in the wake of Crisis, he made Oliver Queen a more relevant and popular character. But by 1993, Grell's era was itself coming to a close after 80 issues. There was just one small matter before walking out the door, writing that year's Annual, which saw print alongside his last issues on the title. Now, supposedly, according to Grell, the story in this issue was not the first story he pitched. The first story he pitched had a completely different new blood at the center of it. Apparently, at least according to Grell, the first draft featured a much better character, enough so that Grell thought twice about using the story during an event in which creators were being paid a whole $250 to think up new IP for the company. So, the Hook, who we meet here, is the guy he thought up on the fly so as not to accidentally bequeath a good idea idea to the company on his way out. Does it read like it? Well, it doesn't not read like that. As was often the case in the period, Green Arrow made a poor fit whenever he was dragged into any of the company's de rigueur crossovers. Grell had revitalized the character by cutting him off almost entirely from the more fantastic trappings of the DC universe, an effect that was maintained down to the subtle detail of him never actually being called Green Arrow anywhere but on the cover of the magazine. But this is Bloodlines. Alien monsters walk the earth and hunt humans for food. It may not seem like a good fit for Oliver Queen circa 1993, but if the Legion had to shoehorn a parasite, despite the small matter of them being set 1,000 years in the future, then by God, so does Green Arrow. And you should be happy to hear that this annual also features Lysic, the same oddly hypersexual parasite who was turning lonely men into her own private zombie army in the Green Lantern Annual. Here we get to see her flirting with Oliver Queen at a charity gala for multiple pages, prior to her ducking out to finish eating some people. Now, as for the Hook, the character is a disabled Vietnam vet, missing a hand in his eyesight, having lost both during the fall of Saigon. He's homeless and living on the streets of Seattle when he encounters the parasite. He then wakes up dead in a morgue with a strange radar sense and a giant energy hook. One interesting factor here, the art is by British talent Mike Collins, a mainstay for both 2000 AD and DC during the period, in addition to being the man who drew the first ever appearance of Gambit in Uncanny X-Men. He's working with 6 inkers, so maybe this isn't the best example of his art, but he seems to enjoy drawing the parasite. Every big spread featuring the monster looks fantastic, also thanks to the colorist, the ever-reliable Patricia Mulvihill. As for the Hook, 3 appearances total, but he wasn't killed by Superboy Prime during Infinite Crisis at least. He was killed by Prometheus during Faces of Evil. So that's something. What? I don't know. Howdy, folks. Today we're looking at Detective Comics Annual number 6 from 1993 in DC Comics, Chapter 14 of Bloodlines. The parasites make their 3rd appearance in Gotham City and once again encounter a substitute Batman, Jean-Paul Vallée, the once and future Azrael. This story takes place right before the events of Batman 500. He's already designed the gauntlets from the bat armor he'll be wearing to take down Bane, and the issue is festooned with multiple ads showing off the armor. That armor might have come in handy against a parasite, as this issue also once again features a Batman outclassed by the space monsters, throwing down and almost getting himself killed in the process. This issue marks a turning point in the series as the first ever acknowledgement, over halfway through, of any kind of organized response on the part of the superheroes. Thanks to Oracle, word has gotten out about 6 alien parasites, racking up a body count, which isn't much, but is still the first such mention of any mobilized response. The cops are still in the dark for their part, which leads to Harvey Bullock and Renee Montoya almost getting slaughtered while investigating. A scene which also features the casual admission by Montoya that she's packing extraordinarily illegal hollow point bullets because it was the 90s. In any event, the real draw here is the art by a young Jim Bayland. I've seen a lot of Bayland art recently, and it must be said, again and with emphasis, that we have completely underrated him as a talent. This comic hit stands the month after his star turn at the launch of the company's first ongoing Catwoman book, and is pointedly free of anything even resembling cheesecake, and it's one of the nicer looking books in the entire series. Ballant is a savvy and effective storyteller with excellent moody backgrounds throughout. Something specific that jumps out is that occasionally in his early work, people's heads aren't quite the right shape, but to be fair, heads are one of the more difficult things to draw from multiple angles. He got it with time. He's working with Jerry Fernandez here, not an inker I remember all that well, but apparently a strong hand for background detail. Like a lot of the Bloodlines annuals, this is simply a much nicer looking comic than it has any right to be. Art Adams' design work for the parasites carries a great deal of the weight here. Supposedly, artists hated the designs for being so fussy and precise. But facts are facts. Grudging or no, almost every artist involved in Bloodlines, even on the weaker annuals, drew some nice-looking alien monsters. Was it an imposition to ask 20-odd different artists to all replicate Art Adams' meticulous design work for a crossover no one was jazzed about in the first place? Possibly. But looking at matters from 30 years removed, the creature designs are hands down the best part of the story. They look good on the page as drawn by a wide variety of different artists, and that's really all that matters. I haven't even mentioned this issue's new blood, Geist. He's pretty unexceptional. He turns invisible in direct sunlight. Quite useful. 14 appearances total, including membership in the Blood Pack, and a by now de rigueur death in Infinite Crisis. Howdy, folks. Today we're looking at Justice League America Annual number 7 from 1993 in DC Comics, Chapter 15 of Bloodlines. And over halfway through the saga, the plot finally begins to move, by which I mean the superheroes ramp up their organized response. We've gone in the space of a couple installments, from the heroes passing word amongst themselves via Oracle, to the Justice League of America conducting press conferences to try and stem any panic from the public knowledge that alien parasites stalk the land. The cat is out of the bag. This installment arrives at a strange time for the Justice League. The Giffen and DeMatteis era is long gone, supplanted in its time by a more conventional hero book, still using many of the same characters. The main book was, at this point in mid-93, just finishing up a brief run from writer Dan Jurgens, who pulled the JLA closer into the orbit of the Superman books during the death of Superman. Jurgens, however, is nowhere to be found here, with the writing responsibilities for this annual devolving onto the great William Messner-Loebs. If you don't know his work, Messner-Loebs is responsible for my personal favorite run on Flash, which wrapped up the year prior to this, as well as a highly underrated tenure on Wonder Woman that ran concurrent to this. His stories are defined above all else by an unerring focus on human concerns in the midst of world-shattering events. Understated and even subtle, his commitment to quiet humanism was unique in an era when the industry was moving away from expansive supporting casts. He's teamed up here again with his partner from The Flash, Greg LaRocque, someone who fits well with Messner-Loebs for his willingness to fill his pages with many different kinds of human beings, a fully populated universe of people whose lives seem infinitely more real than the superheroes who form their ostensible subject matter. Messner-Loebs gives us an interesting inversion on the Bloodlines formula, whereas every annual so far has focused to a greater or lesser degree on the individual new blood characters embracing their heroic potential. This annual asks the question, what if a total schmuck got his metagene activated by a parasite assault? The very first page of the issue introduces us to Jack Mobley, dying of pancreatic cancer after an underwhelming life spent blaming other people for his own shortcomings. He just happens to run into our old pal Lysick, who tricks Jack into taking her back to his apartment, at which point he becomes a meal. The good news for Jack is that he wakes up cancer-free. The bad news is that he's become something of a monster himself, and discovers the ability to transform other people into hideous mutated freaks. Of course, he can't actually control them, as he learns to his chagrin, so the best he can do is create rampaging mobs of monsters for the Justice League to clean up. This is, it must be said, a particularly ragtag group of heroes. Wonder Woman's on board, sure, but Blue Beetle is still recovering from injuries sustained from fighting Doomsday. Booster Gold is stuck in that ugly, chunky power armor he wore for a few years. Fire's lost her powers altogether. Guy Gardner is using Sinistro's yellow ring. Bloodwind is still a thing, and Maxima keeps threatening to kill Max Lord. Forgive me if I'm not confident regarding these guys' chances against 3 marauding alien parasites, or even the whiny schmuck turning people into rampaging mutants. As for Terror Smith, well, according to the ever-reliable DCFandom.com, dude appeared twice, here and once more in an issue of Showcase 94. Doesn't even get brought back to fight the parasites at the end of the crossover. Howdy, folks. Today we're looking at Adventures of Superman Annual number 5 from 1993 in DC Comics, Chapter 16 of Bloodlines. We begin with the aftermath of another massive crossover. The events of this story take place immediately following Adventures of Superman number 504, near the climax of the reign of the Supermen. So far, we've seen the first 3 Supermen created in the wake of Big Blue's brief passing, with Steel, the cyborg Superman, and the Eradicator all getting a chance at the alien parasites, and so we're left only with the erstwhile Superboy. We pick up with the Metropolis Kid recuperating in the hospital following injuries sustained saving Metropolis from a giant missile, and it's there we see the Metropolis PD's Maggie Sawyer drafting Superboy to help in the hunt against the parasites, leaving a trail of bodies across the city while the Supermen are busy. This annual benefits from being written by the men who are also responsible for Superboy in the regular title, Carl Kiesel and Tom Grummett, also on board for the inevitable Superboy spin-off later that year. With Superman back full-time, a new status quo is necessary for the characters introduced during his absence. We see here that the new Superboy already had the bare bones of a supporting cast in place, in the form of his unctuous manager Rex Leach and his daughter Roxy. This issue also features the fateful first meeting between Superboy and the 90s iteration of Krypto, who would follow Superboy to Hawaii when the Kid's Own series relocated him. seeds are dutifully planted regarding the nature of Superboy's powers, a mystery which would also soon come to the fore. Also, notably, Superboy's attempts at flirting with Maggie Sawyer come to naught, another bit of foreshadowing towards a decidedly different kind of long-running subplot. As for the parasites themselves, yes, we must still discuss the parasites. They appear in Metropolis in their human guises, locating an abandoned building ostensibly for the purpose of building a public kitchen for the homeless. But you can probably guess that the real intention involves eating people. Into this tableau stumbles this week's new blood, Donna Carol Force, aka Sparks. Donna Carol, DC for short, is a member of a mysterious family of superhumans, the Force family, come down to Metropolis for the express purpose of being attacked by a parasite and triggering her dormant metagene. So, to recap, the parasites have gone from being a secret invasion to a public threat, with people now putting themselves into harm's way for the purpose of possibly gaining superpowers, which is, if we're being frank, not the worst idea we've seen in the story so far. DC's gamble works. She stumbles upon an attempted murder by the parasites and throws herself into the mix, and awakens with impressive electrical powers, choosing the name Sparks. No relation to Livewire, a similar looking power set still a couple years down the road from here. Now, of all the new blood we've seen, Sparks was one of the most successful. Not only was she later seen in the Blood Pack, hardly a feat in itself, but she was also a member of the short-lived Superboy and the Ravers, which lasted 19 issues from 1996 to 97. That meant further appearances down the line in the pages of Young Justice and Teen Titans, and even a brief appearance in Infinite Crisis, during which she actually wasn't killed by Superboy Prime. She didn't die at all. She notched up 50 appearances, which almost certainly has to land her into the number 2 slot of the all-time most successful new blood, second only, of course, to a certain Tommy Monahan, who remains to be revealed. Howdy, folks. Today we're looking at Hawkman Annual number 1 from 1993 in DC Comics, Chapter 17 of Bloodlines. At some point in the early 90s, someone at DC must have lost a bet with a malicious leprechaun because they printed a lot of Hawkman comics. Was Hawkman popular? Well, in all seriousness, he was about as popular in 1990 as he ever was. That was the year of Tim Truman's Hawkworld series. That was the post-crisis reboot that recreated Hawkman, Hawkwoman, and their home planet Thanagar, and spawned an ongoing series that lasted a few years before eventually being relaunched as Hawkman. Of course, this would itself prove to be something of a problem, as the idea of a post-crisis Hawkman flew in the face, if you'll pardon the pun, of the fact that they already had another Hawkman flying around immediately following the crisis, and he didn't look or act anything like that guy. Hawkman continuity was a festering boil, a miasma that featured prominently in the plot of 0 Hour, a series designed to clean up a number of nagging threads left over from the crisis. That inherent confusion over Hawkman's identity was exaggerated, certainly, but the books at the time made the mistake of leaning into it. For instance, this story here, set after Hawkman had been living in Chicago for years, is premised on the idea that this is a new Hawkman who doesn't recognize his old friends and allies. Looking back with 31 years hindsight, the fact that they spent years leaning into this confusion is absolutely bonkers. And speaking of absolutely bonkers, yes, we're still talking about Bloodlines. This week's chapter is written by the great John Ostrander. There's a floor of competency below which John Ostrander comics do not sink, it must be said. His work on Hawkman is nowhere near as strong as Suicide Squad or Grimjack, but it's still readable with interesting ideas peppered throughout. However, this is no mere Hawkman epic. This is Bloodlines, and the focus of our story today is the new blood character, Mongrel. Now, as far as these characters go, Mongrel's actually one of the better creations from the story. A strong enough character that you almost wish he hadn't been plugged into Bloodlines. He's an angry kid growing up without parents in Chicago. His dad was a U.S. soldier who almost died in Cambodia in 1970. He was found and nursed back to life by a Cambodian family, decided he liked that life better than Chicago, and stayed AWOL with his new wife. 7 years later, the infant who would be Mongrel is smuggled out of the country during the worst days of Pol Pot's genocidal regime to be raised by his grandmother in the States, hence the purposely inflammatory name Mongrel, half black, half Cambodian, all angry. An interesting character, like I say. Too bad he just happens to run into our old pal Lysick, cruising around the alleyways of Chicago looking for sad boys she can murder and devour. We're far enough into Bloodlines by now that I can say with some clarity that Lysick's on another trip entirely from the rest of her squad. The parasites as a whole are rather single-minded in their focus. It's only Lysick that really seems to get off on the carnage. She's the character that the writers themselves seem to have more fun with. The art here is tackled by two veterans who share an earlier affiliation with the Kubert School. Half the comic is drawn by Jan Duursema, a familiar presence across both the DC and Marvel lines at the time, and later well-known known for her long affiliation with Dark Horse's Star Wars books. The other half is drawn by Steve Lieber in what Comics.org assures me was his first work for either Marvel or DC, and only his fourth ever professional comic book work, period. After this annual, Lieber becomes Hawkman's regular artist for the next few years. Apparently, someone was buying it. As for Mongrel, 15 appearances total. He shows up in Hawkman a few times and serves as a member of the Blood Pack prior to, you guessed it, being murdered by Superboy Prime in Infinite Crisis.